Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. This is the second in a short series on creating a pop-up image slider like this, where you can come in here and click through these images, and it's just an infinite gallery. It'll just loop back around. You can click on these indicators as well. You can also close this out or click off the modal and it will close. So you can play around with the completed code up here at codinginpublic.dev, or you can also jump over here and code along with me at lesson 2 branch on this GitHub link. Just go ahead and grab the code, download it, and open it, or you can clone the whole thing and navigate to this branch. Once you've got it open up in your code editor, what we're going to do today is go from this to actually opening up the modal. And then next time we'll actually work on the image sliding and all that kind of stuff. All right, so to get started, first of all, we need to go ahead and add a link to a JavaScript file that we have yet to write. So let's do that. Let's come in here and we're going to do script src. And in here, let's do a relative path to a file in a JavaScript folder here. We're going to call it, let's call it gallery app.js. All right, now I'm going to say type of module, and we want to do that because we're going to be loading files within that. And then let's defer this to load after the body. You can add script tags in the head like this. A lot of times you'll see them added below the body. But if you hit defer, it'll basically load it down here anyhow. So I like to kind of just keep these together so I know where everything's at that's linked in the file. All right, so I'm going to save that and come over this way, and let's create a folder called JS. And in here, let's create a file, and this is called gallery app.js. All right, just to make sure everything is hooked up properly, let's console log hooked up properly, which seems appropriate. Properly. All right, and then I'll open up the console over this way, and it's hooked up properly. Okay, cool. So very first thing we need to do is just think through the steps of the project. So the first thing we need to do is to create the modal HTML, and we're going to do this with JavaScript. And then next we're going to add modal CSS to this. And then finally, we want some modal functionality. And let's see, underneath here, the first thing we want it to do is open, and then we want it to close, and then we want some event listeners. So under close here, we want it to close, let's see, on click of modal. And then we also want it to close clicking the X button. And then we also want it to close when we hit the escape key. Okay, so if we do this today, I think we're going to call this a good video. And because we've got to write a bunch of CSS as well and the HTML, it might actually take a good little bit to get this up and running. Now, why would we want to do this with JavaScript? Well, part of it is so that you can just have an HTML page like this, and as long as you've got data-modal equals true, which is what we're going to use to trigger the modal opening, then all you have to do is load this gallery app.js file, and it will actually populate it with everything else you need. So that's one of the reasons you might do it like this. All right, let's come back over this way. I'm going to comment this out for now. And what we're going to do is go ahead and write a function that we're going to call create modal. We want to create that HTML. And then by default, we're going to run this on page load. We're going to want to add the modal to the HTML. So let's go ahead and grab the body. So I'm going to say document.querySelector. We're going to grab the body itself, and we want to insert adjacent HTML. Now there's a couple things you have to give this. First of all, you have to give it where you want it to insert it. And there's a few options. There's 4 options. We want before end. If you're curious how that works, you can check out the MDM docs. And then what I want to do is insert whatever HTML I want to add. So I'm going to add backticks here. So we can just add a bunch of HTML right here in the body of the document. So everything we're going to add is going to be wrapped in something called modal container. This is a div with modal container. I'm going to expand that out. And what we're going to do is say we want the aria modal to equal true. And this tells screen readers and other assistive technology that this is a pop-up modal. And then we'll set this also a role of dialog. All right, and then we're going to actually add a hidden class here so that by default it's hidden. But for now, let's leave it alone so that we can actually see it. And we'll add that here in a second. All right, now just to make sure this is working, I'm going to save this. And let's come over here. You can already see something happened because the whole screen shifted around, and we do have that modal container that's just being loaded on page load. Okay, so inside here, we're going to want one thing called a modal. So this will be our class. We're just going to call it modal of class. And then inside here, we're going to have 2 sections. We're going to have the actual image itself, the div that holds the images, and then we're going to have an overlay that has our buttons and our indicators and all that kind of stuff. So first of all, let's have our modal overlay here. So I'm going to just call it modal overlay, and I'm going to have two areas here. We're going to have a button container and indicators. Now the way I want this to go is when I first open up the modal, if I were to tab, the first thing I want it to tab to is the actual buttons themselves, the backwards and forwards buttons, and then next to actually hit the indicators. So I'm going to code the markup like that, and then we can change how they display with CSS. So we're going to have modal button container, and inside here we're going to have 3 buttons. If we come back over and look at our finished project, you see we've got a backwards button, a close button, and a forwards button. That's what we're working on now. Then we'll work on these indicators actually next time when we get around to adding those dynamically, depending on which gallery we are currently viewing. Okay, so let's come over this way, and I'm going to add a button here, and it's going to have a class of modal button, and then we're going to have a few other classes on this one. It'll have modal arrow to tell me it's one of those right or left arrows, and then finally modal arrow left, like that. I'll also have an ID of left on this. If I expand this out, that should work just fine, and then I'm going to add one more thing. We're going to add an ARIA label to say previous image. And this, again, is for assistive technology. It'll tell it, hey, this is what this button does. Because I don't have any text in the button, it's important to have some kind of indication of what the button does functionally. All right, now inside this button, I'm going to have an SVG, and I've gotten these from iconic.app. These are awesome, and I really like the design of them. There's a pro tier, but there's also lots of free stuff that's great. So I'm going to come in here and grab an arrow, and let's see. We want this arrow left. And if I come over here, I can just copy the SVG directly, and I'll paste it in here. And you'll notice that by default, it sets the stroke color to current color, which means the parent, this button, whatever color we give this, will be inherited by the child as the current color. So that's awesome. All right, we're also going to grab a few other things, but for now, let's leave that alone. And let's jump down. We're going to have 2 more. Modal button, this is the close, will be the next one we add. And we just need to add modal close to this. So it's got the class that's shared by all 3, and then modal close, and then the ID. We don't really need an ID here. This ARIA label here, though, will say close gallery. All right, and then let's go ahead and find that close button. So close or X, I think this is the one I think I used. So I'll copy this here, and we're just going to paste this in directly here. And then finally, one more down here, we've got an arrow, let's see, left. These will both be changed to right, and this will say next image. And then I'll come back here, and we're going to say arrow again, and grab the right one. With that on my clipboard, I'm going to paste it in here. And if I save it and return over here, they should now be showing, and they are. Cool. Now if I come back over here, let's close the sidebar so we've got a little bit more room. Everything's inside a modal container div. Then the modal itself is here, and it has 2 sections I mentioned. This modal overlay, and we've got to add one more thing to it. But let's go ahead and space this out just to remember. Let's see, modal overlay, modal button container. So let's see, this is the overlay right here. So inside this button container is the first one. We've got those 3 buttons, and then we've also got our indicators. And here we're just going to have a class of modal indicator container. We're going to be adding all these indicators with JavaScript, but for now, let's go ahead and add something so we can style it. So we're just going to add one right now. It will be a button just like up above, but it'll have a class of modal indicator. For now, let's just leave that alone. We'll style that here in a second. Okay, so all of this belongs to the overlay, and now here's where we're going to add the images. All the images will be inside a div with a class of modal image container. All right, and that's it. We're going to actually add all of that with JavaScript as well. Just so we can see what that's going to look like, though, we need to actually style it. So we're going to have an image here with a class of modal image. And we're going to go ahead and let's just grab some random image from our images folder. And I think, let's pull this up so I can see what we got here. Let's go for food, and then food -1.jpg. And right now we'll have an alt of food. All right, that way we can style this properly. And if I expand this or save it, you see it actually pulls up here. Okay, so everything is working. This is our modal indicator. Or let's see, where's our modal indicator? It must be hiding somewhere. We'll find that when we get around to it. And then we've also got, it's got no height or width. So that's why it's not showing. But those are our buttons, and then this is our image. All right, so let's go ahead and work on the styling. Let's collapse this again. And below here, because we're just adding HTML, we can just add some styling here. And you might want to do this in a style sheet that you load as well. You're welcome to do that. I'm just going to do it inline here because we're only ever going to need this when the modal is on the page. So we might as well load it at the same time and keep it all right here next to the HTML. If we head back up top here, we've already done this first one. We've created the modal HTML. So now we're already on step 2. So I'll come back down here. And the first thing we're going to do is style the entire container. So modal container. And here we're going to have position of absolute. And we'll do inset of 0, which is the same as saying top 0, left 0, bottom 0, and right 0. And if I save this, automatically it will pull out of the flow of the document. And it's actually covering everything else right now because we have yet to hide it or anything like that. Next, we've got a background color that we want to add. So background color. And this is our HSL var of dark. And let's do a little opacity. I mentioned I do this last time just so I can live add opacity just like that. That's why I do the variables the way I do. And if you're curious how I did that, you can check out the last video. If I save it here, you should see it actually darken just a bit over here. I don't know if you could see that. But the next thing we're going to do is do display of grid. And then let's go ahead and place the items in the center. Now, originally, I don't want this to show, and I can hide it here by adding a hidden attribute equals true. And then let me come back down because I actually want to style this as well. So I'm going to say opacity of 0 and pointer events of none. And the reason I'm doing that is so I can't click on it or anything like that. If I save, it should all disappear, which is great. Now I can click on these things in spite of the fact that that's technically over all of this. But I want to add a little transition here so that when I add it back in, it's a slow transition rather than just instant. The only thing I want to set the transition on is on the opacity property. We'll do 250 milliseconds, and then let's just do ease in and out. All right, now let's go ahead and add that modal container with a class of active. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space. What do I want to change when it has this active class? Well, I want the opacity to now be 1, and then the pointer events to be all. If I save this here, let me go ahead and inspect the element, and I'm going to add on here the class of active, and it should pull up like that. And if I were to remove it, it should disappear. All right, so that's working properly. We're going to obviously use some JavaScript to get that working. For now, just so I can see what's going on, let's go ahead and remove active here just so that everything is, this overrides this, and we can actually see what we're doing. All right, that's the modal container, that's the parent. Now the child, the thing that holds the images, the buttons, all that kind of stuff, is modal. And here we want a little bit of space, so we're going to do margin of 2 rem, and we'll do a max width of 900 pixels, and then a width of 100%. So it tries to be as big as possible, but no bigger than 900 pixels. We will do display of grid to place everything here in the middle. We can do that with 2 lines, place items center. That's the same as saying align item center and justify items center. We will go ahead and do overflow of hidden here. We'll remove this in a second so you can kind of see what's going on. And then finally, we're going to do a box shadow of 0 pixels. That's the x-axis, 2 pixels down, and then 40 pixels of blur. And we'll do an HSL here of our var of dark. So if I save that, everything should move in the middle. Not too much changes. It's hard to see that that box shadow, but if I pull out here, you can see there's some kind of fading off here. That's what the box shadow is adding. Now you might remember there's 2 things in the modal. There's that overlay, and then there's the images themselves. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's add a few more images just so we're going to get a taste of exactly what that's going to look like. So if I add all of those, actually let's just add 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. So the images themselves lived in something called modal image container. And here we're going to say display a flex. That will naturally set them side by side. And then we're going to say max height of 100 view height. This would be for like mobile. When you turn the mobile device, it would only ever take up the full height of the screen. Now we can't see any of this because I've got overflow hidden. So let me take that off, and you'll see that all they're doing is stacking out this way. Eventually, when we move the entire stack, we're just going to move this image container, and it will actually just pull its children behind it. In order for that to work, though, we've got to have our modal images all set to say we want them to take 100% of their parent container and 100% height and width. And then to make sure they're not stretched weirdly or whatever, we're going to do an object fit of cover. And if I save that, you see they already try to expand out to take that 900 pixels, which is the max width that the parent container lets them have. And they also all share the same size. Now there is a new property we can add that's not fully supported, but it's not going to hurt to add it as long as you're not totally relying on it right now. But that is aspect ratio. And this is really cool. You could just do like 16 by 4 or 8 or 9 or whatever. Let's do by 10, and it will actually move the images to be that exact aspect ratio. Even when we get smaller, they stay the exact same. You could obviously change this to whatever you want. So you could do like a 1 by 1 or something like that, which will make them exactly square no matter what your screen size is. Let's just do 16 by 10, and even if this is off, the images themselves still look fine. It just shrinks them just a bit. So we're going to do that just for fun, and you might be able to use that in something, but just as a reminder, it's not fully supported. All right, so that was half the battle. Now the other half of the battle is to get the overlay set up. So we're going to do the modal overlay, and that held our buttons, our indicators, all that kind of stuff. The first thing we need to do is do position of absolute. If I do that first, the parent doesn't have relative, and so these are just going to be absolute in relation to the entire body. So I actually need to come back up this way, let's see, to the modal itself. And let's add in here position of relative. And it won't look like a whole lot changed, but we're going to be able to now move this container around relative to that modal itself as the parent. We should probably technically add a Z index here and on the other thing. Let's just do like, I don't know, 4 or something like this. This is obviously a simple site, but you'd need to have some kind of structure for when you would use what Z index, but I'll leave that to you. We want this to be in relationship to its parent, 1 rem off the bottom, and then we do want display of grid, and then we'll have a gap of 1 rem. We've got 2 things in this overlay, those buttons that you can see visibly there, and then the indicators. So let's work on them in that order. So we'll take our modal button container. This holds all 3 of those buttons there. We're going to say display a flex. By default, they're kind of already set out that way, but we'll do a gap of 1 rem to space them out just a bit. And then all of those, remember, had a shared class of modal button. Now you might remember that those SVGs had current color as the stroke, which means I could come in here and say color is red on this parent, and then all of those SVGs are going to pick up that color. Now obviously we don't want red. We'd want our HSL var of text. And they should all pick up that dark color. Now if you're observant there, you'll see that the buttons aren't exactly in the middle, and that's because of the way that they're spaced out inside that button. So I'm going to have a display of grid, and then place items center. Now they should be exactly in the middle of those buttons. In fact, I'm going to pull that up top, and then here we're going to have a background color. To get away from the default for the browser, I'm going to add our background, and again I'm going to add a little bit of transparency. We'll do 50% transparency, and again that's how I set up those variables so that I could do that on the fly when I wanted to. They should have some padding as well, so we'll do 0.5 rem. We're going to add a border of 4 pixels solid and transparent so we can actually toggle that on when we hover or focus on the button. And then I do want them to be circular, so we'll do border radius of 50%. And then we'll do a cursor of pointer. And if I save it there, you see they all kind of snap into position. Now I'm going to come in here and copy this down because the modal button is also going to have a hover state, and it will have a focus state. So I'm going to use an is selector here and select both of those. And then let's see, I need to change the border. So I'm going to leave that alone. And then actually, I also want to change the background color. So let me leave both of those. And all we're going to do is change the opacity slightly on this background color So we'll make it a little bit less transparent, so 0.7. And then for the border here, we're going to do our HSL background as well, and we're going to do 0.8. So if I save this and then come in here, you see that they pull up with that border, and then the background color gets slightly lighter. Now those SVGs inside of here, I want to do something too on hover, but for now, I also just need to work on the SVGs. So the first thing I'm going to do is do pointer events of none. Now the reason I'm doing that is because you could technically click on the SVG and not the button, in which case when we're triggering events on JavaScript and stuff like that, it will not do anything. And so we want to make sure that you can't click on those. Next, I'm going to actually set the width manually here and the height manually to make sure they're the exact same. And then let's go ahead and add a hover state as well. So if I come in here and let's see, when I'm hovering on the button is what I'm concerned about. So hovering or focusing on the button, then I want to do something to the SVG. The something is I want to add a transform scale of 1.2. So let's come in here and I come in here and you see that they have this little hover state. Okay, now it's kind of sudden right now. So what I want to do is add on both of these some kind of transition. So I'll first of all say transition here. We're going to do transform, 250 milliseconds. We'll just do ease. All right, now if I come in here, they should kind of slowly get bigger, and you see that's what happens. And then just to get extra spicy here, let's if you can get spicy with buttons, let's see, on this ease, we're going to add our own little cubic Bezier curve. I like to do this because I think it looks better than just a standard ease. So something like this, I don't know, fine by me. Okay, we'll grab this. Let's test it real fast. It's all right. Okay, we're going to come in here and change all of that. And then the same transition we want on the actual button itself because that's what gains the background color and the border. And we want, let's see, I guess we want here the background color. And then we're also going to want the border. So if I add a comma here and paste that in, I can change this now to border. And that should work. So now they should all kind of go in sync together. Okay, so the only thing we've got left then is our indicators. Right now we've got just a single indicator hanging out by itself. That lives in something called a modal indicator container. Now we're not really going to be able to see anything until we actually have some height and width on those indicators. So let's go ahead and copy this down and let's remove container. So we're just going to work on the indicator itself. And we need to say width of 1 rem and height of 1 rem. So it'll be 16 pixels basically by default. We're going to have a border radius of 50%. So they're going to look kind of like those buttons. They'll be circular. And let's see, we want background color. And here we're going to do our HSL as well, a background. And we're going to do the same kind of thing where we add in some transparency. We'll do the same thing on the border. So we'll have border here. We obviously need some more things. So we'll need 3 pixels solid. We'll do the same thing, but a little bit darker border, just kind of like we did on these buttons themselves on the hover state. Now, because they're just divs, we need to add a cursor pointer. Now, if I save it here, they should show up. Okay, so I've got just this single one. Let's go ahead and add a couple more just so we can actually see them live. If I save there, I've now got 3 set out that way. But this is where this button, let's see, not button container, the modal indicator container will come in handy. So I'm going to say display a flex and then justify, justify content center and then a gap of 1 rem. So they should space out, be right in the middle. Now, you might remember in the live example, these are actually up top, but we ordered the HTML this way so that these would be the first things focusable by the tab. And then these would be next. Now, we can really easily just switch the order here because this is a grid child to -1. And that will actually put it before everything else. 0 is the default, so you can order things like that in either grid containers or flux containers with the order property. Now, ultimately, what we're going to do is whenever the image is active, we're going to add a class of active. So let me come back up here. And on one of these, I'm going to add the class of active. All right, let's come back down. Then we're going to say, let's copy this down, this modal indicator. And we're going to say when it has a class of active on it, Then we want to add a before pseudo element. And here what we need, let's just leave some of that for now. Content is nothing. We don't need anything there, but you do have to have that. And then we need position of absolute. And then we would need an actual position of relative here on the indicator itself. And you can see that pulls off this way because I've got all these same properties hanging out. But then what I'm going to do is do inset of 2 pixels. So this is relative to its parent. And we don't need to have a width or a height. We will leave the border radius so that it's also circular. We don't need that. We don't need that. I will go ahead and add the same background color, but actually change the transparency. And when I save it, it shows up right in the middle, 2 pixels off the parent. Now we do want some kind of hover state on these when we go to click, just to indicate that they can be clicked. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this down. And we're going to say anytime that there is a hover or there is a focus state, I just want to update the background color and the border. So kind of like we did with our buttons themselves, this let's change to like, I don't know, 7, something like that. And then this let's change to 5. And now if I come in here, they should actually change. You can see it kind of indicates, hey, you can click on this. If you click, then it would change it to active. All right, so that's all the CSS and the HTML I think we need to do. There may be some things we forget about as we move on in the next projects or the next video. But for now, we've gone ahead and created this modal on page load. Now let's see, I do need to go ahead and uncomment a few things. Let's see. This overflow hidden, we're going to need to uncomment eventually. Let's leave it on now because we're going to use that next time. And it's helpful to be able to visualize where these things are. I do, however, need to come back in here and add active back in. And so that it needs to be visible there, or active needs to be on the actual modal container for it to show. Hidden is equal to true. Okay, so all the rest of that is fine. All right, so now we have added the CSS. All right, step 3, modal functionality. Now this is already getting to be quite a long file, and really this is just one function that basically just loads in HTML and CSS. So let's go ahead and split this off into its own little script file. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add a file called create. Let's see, create gallery. How do you feel about that? I feel pretty good about that. Let's grab this here and let's add all this in here. Create gallery. We won't run it in here. We're just going to export this. So I'll come up top here and say this needs to be export, and this is the default. So I'll save that. Then I'm going to come into my gallery app, and here we're going to say import. It's called create modal, but we can call it whatever we want because we set it as the default export from, and then in quotation marks here, I'm going to do, let's see, JS create gallery.js. Now I should be able to just type create modal like that, and it should actually load on page load. So let's see if that works. And of course, that only works if you actually do your relative path correctly. So let's see, that should work. When we pull in here, modal container is there just like we'd expect. Okay, so we've basically loaded our gallery app file and automatically just created all of that HTML and the CSS that we need directly in here. All right, now let's actually work on this functionality. This is already on the page by the time we get to this point in the file. Let me close this down here. So what we can do then is say const, let's call modal container and look for the document.querySelector.modal container. All right, that was what was given to us on page load. Now we're going to kind of do this video differently from the next one just to show you 2 different ways. We're going to do a more object-oriented approach this time, and the next time we'll do more functional, and you can do either way. Usually don't mix them up like this, but just to kind of show you both as possibilities. By object-oriented, I'll show you what I mean in a second here. But if I come in here, I'm going to say, let's call a modal, create a variable called modal, and then we're going to say new modal with a capital M and pass in our modal container. And then just so you can see what this is going to look like, I'm going to console log modal here, and I'm going to write up here class modal. To do a class, we need a constructor. This is going to take in whatever we passed in, which is the modal. You don't have to call it the same thing as the variable, but in fact, you probably shouldn't. And then we're going to add this dot modal equals modal. And then let's go ahead and write one function on here, one method, just so you can see what this looks like, and then I'll explain what we're doing. All right, so we've got a function here, which you can just write just like this inside of this class, open modal, and then let's go ahead and add this dot modal, which is the current modal that we're looking at, dot remove attribute. We're going to remove the attribute hidden. And then we'll say this dot modal dot class list dot add, and we're going to add the class of active. Now, if I save this here and we look at the console, it should actually be returning to us this console log of the modal object. And notice we've got two things on here. Number one, we've got this property here of modal, and that is equal to the actual modal that we passed in, which is this query selector. So I get everything else that I would get on a div element. And so that means I get all of these properties. I get any kind of functions or methods that live on it as well. I get the child nodes, all this kind of stuff. The other thing I got is something called a prototype. Everything in JavaScript ultimately is an object, and you can attach functions or methods to objects like this. And you'll notice that the constructor, that's what tells us what made this class of modal, is what we passed in up, let's see, right here. So it tells us all about it, the constructor itself, and then also, in addition to this, we also get the function that we wrote, that method that's attached to this object. Now, where this becomes really helpful is using the this keyword. If we had multiple modals, we could write basically one class for modals and then just initialize each of them like this, instantiate them, and they would all get access to these functions. And JavaScript is going to keep track of these functions for each modal separately. Now, of course, you can also just write this functionally and pass in an actual query selector and say, hey, when this exact thing is clicked, click on this exact modal and open it. But this is another way to do it with a more object-oriented approach. Now, for sake of time, I'm not going to go a whole lot more into object-oriented programming. I'm just kind of showing you how it works. Maybe one of these days I can do a tutorial. There are lots of great ones out there. I'll try to link one in the description by NetNinja that I think is awesome. For now, we've written a little function here that's going to open the modal. Let's now come over here and we're going to write one that's going to close it. So we'll say close modal. And here we're going to set an attribute this time. We're going to set hidden to be true. And then instead of adding a class, we're going to remove the class of active. Then I'm going to write one more function down here where we're going to attach some event listeners. So let's just say attach event listeners. And this we're going to call as soon as it's constructed. So we'll say this dot attach event listeners. And the event listeners we're going to add are this dot modal, so the actual modal itself, dot add event listener. So we're going to add an event listener on the entire modal that's being instantiated here. That will be click, and then we're going to add the event here. What we're going to check is e.target. That's the thing that was clicked. Does it equal e.currentTarget? That's the actual event listener thing that the event listener was called on. So in other words, if when we click, the whole modal container, this thing is the thing clicked, or if it's something inside of it. So if it is the modal container, then what do we want to do? Well, then we want to say this dot close modal. That will close the modal. Otherwise, we can just say null. Now, there's one other use case in addition to clicking off the modal itself. What we've done right now, just to make sure you're clear, is when we click the modal itself, the modal container itself, it should close down. But the other use case is actually clicking this X. If I click this X, I'd want it to close as well. That's what this is right here. So we can actually say if this is true right here, so this is just a little ternary, or if the thing clicked, which is e.target dot class list dot contains modal close. Now you might be tempted to add a dot here, but because we're already looking at the class list, you don't have to do that. And in fact, if you do, it will break. All right, so if I come over here, right now we can't really see what's going on yet, but if I were to come in here to this console logged modal, you see we've now got open modal, close modal, and then these event listeners called as well. So now we need to do a few more things. We need to actually call this open modal function, or method, and then we need to call this close modal with not only these, but also with the escape key on the entire window. So let's get a little bit more space first of all. So since we wrote open first, let's go ahead and do event listeners just to kind of keep track of what's going on here. And then we're going to say function, and we'll do open image gallery event listeners. Inside here, we're going to do document.querySelector.all. We're going to look for any image here. Now, you might remember we had a data attribute, a custom data attribute, and that was simply data-modal equals true. What I'm going to do then is just loop through each of these and say for each, technically these were buttons. So for each of these buttons, we're going to say button.add event listener. We're listening for a click, and then a little arrow function here. Whenever they're clicked, we want modal.open modal. Opal modal, open modal, like that. All right, so here is the moment of truth. If we click, this should actually run that function. Now, you probably know what's going on. I didn't even run this thing we just ran. So we just wrote. So let's come in here and let's run it immediately. And now if I come over here and click, there you go, the modal opens. Now I should be able to click off and it should close because we've already attached these to the actual modal container. I should be able to click this and it should close as well. So there's one other thing we need to add, and then I want to do one little quality of life improvement here, or maybe two. First thing is window event listener. So we're going to do window.add event listener. We're going to listen for key up, and we're going to grab the event itself. And then we'll just say if e.key, so the name of the key, is equal to escape. So if we hit the escape key, and this is important, we want the modal container, which is that div that holds everything, .classlist, .contains to have active. So we shouldn't close it if it's already closed. All right, so if both of those are the case, then we're going to come in here and say modal.close modal. Because we already wrote that functionality and it's attached to the actual, the modal itself, we should be able to come in here, open this up, hit the escape key, and it should close down. Now, if you're curious how to get these names, you can just console log e.key. There's also, let's see, what is it, keycode, keycode.info, key.info. Yeah, keycode.info. Westboss did this, but basically you can come in here and hit any key, and it'll give you the event.key, event.location, the code, all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that, I'll try to remember to link that in the description. So let's check our list up here. We've got opening, closing of the modal by clicking with the X or the escape key. So we've got all that. Now I promised a couple of quality of life improvements. So the first thing is if we come back this way and we start tabbing through these, remember these are buttons, so we should be able to just tab through them. And then we hit the enter key, we should open. But if I go to tab, the next one, it's actually tabbing those other images first. So we've got a little bit of a problem in that we want to remove the tab index of these whenever we click and then add them back in whenever we close the modal. We can do that fairly easily by coming in here to the open modal and saying we want document.queryselector.all. And here we would grab the same thing, data-modal equals true. So you know what, let's do this. Let's not repeat ourselves. Let's grab all of this and add this as a global query selector up here. So we'll do global query selectors. Let's call these mode-allable images. How about that? So things that can basically open up the modal. That's a dumb name. All right, whatever. There we go. Modable image is, because there's multiples of them. And then what we can do is, where do we have that? Right here. So we can just grab this here, modable images dot for each button. I don't know, I'm starting to like it. And then let's see, open modal right here. For these, we're going to say for each. And then again, we've got these images, or they're really technically buttons. For each of these buttons, then we want the button.tab index to now be set to -1. So if I do that, and I did all that correctly, I should be able to click here, and the next time I hit tab, it should go straight to the left arrow. And that's what happens. Okay, so we do need to add them back in then. So let's copy this down, and we're going to set it back to 0, which is the default. So that is quality of life improvement 1. The next thing, let's get rid of this console log. The next thing we're going to do is go back to our index.html. All of these are buttons themselves, but they don't actually have any text. And so to say what they're doing, we should probably come in here and say aria label, and we'll say open food image gallery. And then let's copy these down as well. And this will say open mountains. This will say open plants. Now I can come in here and I can tab to these and open like that. I can also close out with the escape key. I can click, close out here. I can click and click out here, and all of these should open. Now, right now, obviously the images aren't changing. That's what we're going to do next time. So I hope that was a help working through that. And next time, like I said, what we're going to do is load the galleries, depending on which image we click, get these indicators up, add event listeners to all this kind of stuff, and work on the sliding functionality. If you want to see that, make sure you subscribe, give the video a like. I will catch you next time. Thanks for watching, and happy coding.